Hey, welcome back! Today we're working on weathering my Commando Droid. We're going to start with the Commando Droid's forearm, and as you see, we have these two beautiful colors of our base coat, which I've already spray painted. But we're not here for the brand new fresh off the assembly line look. We are creating the character Haxxon the War Gnome Trigenics, and he's a racer droid. And as such, we're going to give him weathering and a lot of history to really give dimension to his character, because racing on a strange planet is definitely a messy business. So let's break down each layer of the process step by step. We're starting with our airbrush, and this layer is all about creating subtle shadows and depth, especially around the edges and any details like joints or ridges. I'm using a medium to dark brown, and I'm focusing on areas that would naturally see dirt and grime. You want to keep the airbrush moving. I try to do steady and light passes. The goal is to start building up that shadow gradually. I find that it helps to angle the airbrush for different effects. Straight on gives you full color, but a slight tilt softens it and adds that blended look. This way you're not just layering the paint, you're actually telling a story of a droid that's seen some real mileage. Next we're going to start working with our dark brown on the Commando Droid's head. And I won't even lie, I get kind of nervous for these ones because the head is such a visual focal point of the droid. The footage you see here is definitely sped up. In reality, I'm taking my time and thinking about where I'm putting this paint. When I work on my droids, I'm usually blocking off a couple hours minimum of time. It is a lengthy process to work on these droids. And for your entertainment and viewing pleasure, I have sped it up so it doesn't take as long for you to watch it as it took me to paint it. This Commando Droid was printed entirely out of PLA, and this has been a project I've been working on for quite some time. Before I got my Bamboo X1 Carbon, so back then the printing time was extra long. If I tried to redo this today, we would be printing so much faster. One of the other common questions I get when it comes to printing my droids is what are the settings I use? I typically don't stray too far from the default settings. For infill, I usually do between 5 to 10% max, but the area I tweak the most is the wall setting. For walls, I do between 4 to 5 layers. And I actually do this because of a tip that was given to me early in my 3D printing days. The first full-size droid that I ever 3D printed was a pit droid, and I was working on the head, and I remember the infill setting was something like 60%. And I shared that on TikTok, and one of the comments I got was, "Holy infill, Batman!" And they let me know that if I wanted to strengthen my piece, I should try adjusting the wall settings instead of going nuts on the infill. And I tell you, I wish I had done that the first time. To this day, I still consider reprinting that droid's head. That poor thing is so top heavy he barely can stay upright. But that's what introduced me to the wall settings. And like so many things on my 3D printing journey, I am so grateful for people who take the time to comment and share their perspectives and their experience. But I see now that I've gotten too chatty and I've switched colors on you. So now we've gone from that dark brown to this black brown. And again, same principles are really going to apply here, we're just adding more depth and dimension to this piece. A lot of my inspiration for the Commando Droid's paint job was taken from B2 from the Andor series. I absolutely love the weathering on that droid and the high contrast of the darks and the reds. So that's what I was going for here. Alright, now we're moving on to dry brushing with a darker yellow. This is a small step, but it's all about adding warmth, especially in areas that might be more sun faded or rust touched. It's a subtle contrast against that brown, but it really adds to the dimension. Dry brushing is all about patience. I just use a touch of paint on the brush. Almost none. Then I'll wipe it off on my paper towel so there's barely any residue left. My next step will be to hit the raised area and catch that natural light. This will almost feel like dusting the piece with color, which keeps it from overwhelming the brown. And again, we're only doing slight hints of that here. If you're ever unsure of how much paint to leave on the brush, less is always more with dry brushing. Our sponge work is next. Now this might look like a rough and chaotic technique, but don't let it fool you. This step is about control. This used to be a car wash sponge, and I cut it up into small pieces to give me a better grip and accuracy. With my dark umber paint, which is pretty close to black, I'm aiming for spots where we would imagine that we'd naturally see wear, like corners or edges or the occasional random patch. Nothing too precise in weathering. We're going to go through and dab, twist lightly, and let it breathe. I'm going for that used and maybe slightly abused feel, because this droid has probably seen a share of damage. Notice that I'm going over areas that I did with the airbrush. It's going to add another layer of shadow and depth. I like to think of this as organized chaos. It's random enough to feel natural, but controlled enough to keep it from getting too messy. If the paint gets too heavy, you can always dab it on the paper towel first and then go back. This particular droid only appears in the Bad Batch for a few seconds, and we only see his upper torso. So a lot of this paint job is really just my own creative interpretation of what I think this full-size droid would look like. So he may not have been the biggest character in the show, but I thought he was memorable enough to make my own painted droid version of him. I also think he's going to look marvelous standing next to Mr. Bones. Now for the final touches. This is where the fun comes in. Because with the silver paint, we're adding the dings, the scratches, and all those little imperfections that give the piece character. I think about where this droid has been and where he would have taken his hits and scrapes. I'm focusing on the edges, the sides of the joints, and areas that would have had some action. These aren't going to be straight lines. I like to keep things a little bit uneven and natural, with little flecks and scratches. It's easy to get carried away here, but sometimes I have to remind myself, only a little bit more. You want enough silver to hint at the wear, but not so much that it overtakes everything else. By now you've probably noticed my very odd choice in paintbrush, in that this is not actually a paintbrush at all. It's a chopstick I got from Chinese takeout food, and typically when I'm working on the scratches and dings and using my silver paint, this is one of my favorite tools. When I do use a traditional paintbrush for this part of the process, I'll often use the wooden dowel part of it anyway. Scratching away at the piece with the silver paint on the dowel gives it such a natural look, and you get such cool effects. I'll angle my wooden dowel and then run it along the edges, sometimes across the surface, and create focal points for damage. The piece I'm working on here is the main part of the Commando Droid's hand, and because cans are constantly grabbing things, moving things, and being used, we're doing a little bit of extra damage here, because I'm going to assume that it could get chipped and scratched a lot. It's also just plain fun to do. And we'll use the same approach for the remaining pieces. With the weathering finally done on all these pieces, I'm going to move on to my last stage in the process, which will be spray painting with a clear protective coat. If you have any questions on the droid making process, drop them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like and follow. I have so many more great projects in the pipeline, and I can't wait to share them with you.